While men have made considerable gains in power on the continent, and time has moved to favor the forces of Padme, of men, of the mundane, there is still the strength and the fighting against this course of history that has occurred by the elves. And the cloistered elves on Somerset Isle of the Aldmeri Dominion won't go down quietly with their irredentism to try to retake control of the continent. So, in a worldly sense, regain power, dominance over everybody else, but also to make whole once again, or die trying to make whole everything that Lorkhan has done to them. So, this might not be their stated goal throughout the whole history of the series, but they still would strive to have something like that occur. Not all of them. Some of them are quite content with the way the Arbus is, but they still strive to be above the worldly concerns and limitations set before them by mastering magicka that they have an inherent aptitude in using, magicka being the source of arcane divine power that still flows from Aetherius that they can attract and hold within their bodies and use their intellect to manipulate the Arbus in ways that defy mortal limitations. It is a kind of jury rigging, a way to make sure that they can still have that kind of control over the universe, although it is not quite the same as being divine. The elves were dealt a really bad blow, however, with Tiber Septim and the conquest of Somerset Isle by Tiber Septim, who ultimately became Talos with the oversoul of King Wolfharth, a Shezarene, an aspect of Shor himself, and the imperial mage Zurin Arctos, who became the Underking, an undead entity that has preserved Tamriel in cases like the main campaign of Daggerfall. The elves haven't forgotten about this, and some of them live long. Some of them are probably still even alive from when Tiber Septim has done this, because, as I mentioned, Devive Thur lived 4,000 years. He is the only known example we can think of, but how many elves could have been infected by Molag Bal's little gift, just to easily, without even having to need magical skill, learn about this? I mean, we can expect that alteration magic and restoration magic are good avenues to pursue longer lifespan, and plenty of elves have mastered these to a pretty good degree. So, the elves of the Thalmor era are a group that arose during the Oblivion crisis. It was the hero of Kavach, the prisoner, who would become mantling Sheogorath, but he is the one, or she, who is responsible for stopping the Oblivion crisis. The Thalmor took credit for that themselves when the Oblivion gates went away. Their crystal tower was destroyed, which is just another staggering blow to the sanctity of their culture. And later on, with certain manipulations like the assassination of High Chancellor Okato and the disappearing of the moons and the reappearance called the Void Knights, which affected the Khajiit, they cajoled the Khajiit of Elsewhere to become in favor of the Aldmeri Dominion that they have created. But the consequence of all of this is that elven enmity towards the human domain has waxed over time because they've seen all of their power evaporate, and they've had the willpower to regain their dominance of the continent at a time of fragmentation and increasing dysfunction that goes further and further away from the time that Tiber Septim conquered all of Tamriel and used his incredible, military skill, his backstabbing, everything to ensure that this domain of Tiber Septim becomes all of Tamriel, the Empire. And you also have things occur like the death of the gods in Morrowind, the mortal gods, the Almsivi, who had an important effect in working with the regime of Tiber Septim, of the Imperial Cyrodiilic human-led Tamriel. For example, the Almsivi lended him the Numidium, which is a dwarven construct that contains some of the, soul remains of the gods, not the gods, the Dwemer, who tried to create a god using a Numidium of their own creation. Suffice to say, this is a very powerful construct, and he used the Mantella to power it, whereas some believe they wanted to use the Heart of Lorkhan to power it. And finally, the death of them was caused by Dagoth siphoning off power from the heart and weakening their connection to the Heart of Lorkhan. When they die, you essentially have Amalexia and Sothasil die because the former murders the latter, and Vivek goes missing. He becomes immortal, which means that, for all intents and purposes, all of his power to have chime and to be seen beyond time like an immortal, and to still be in awe at the power of somebody like Talos, the Oversoul, it's all gone. He is nothing more than immortal. So, basically, we have fragmentation that had been going on in the earlier games in the series, and the game markedly jumps 200 years to the present of 4E201. And we learn through playing the game that there's been a massive war between the Empire, because the Septim line with the Dragonfires that had long been considered something very important to protect the planet Mundus of Nirn, the realm, from Oblivion. It had been gone. The Covenant had been fortified by Martin Septim, but the power of the Septim bloodline, of the dragon blood, of Elysia, all the way down to Tiber Septim and Martin Septim, that might as well have been seen as the Elder Scrolls version of the petrodollar, something to prop up the human-led empire and their power. After all, it was the Iliads who summoned Daedra and brought their cruelties onto the world of Nirn that had Elysia beckon Akatosh for mercy. So accordingly, now it's much harder, save for really powerful Daedra like Sheogorath, and for, conjurers to temporarily summon a Daedra on Mundus. Well, this succession of events, and with the Mede dynasty's rise, kind of represented the beginning of political instability, and the Oblivion crisis really did a number on the Empire's solidarity, because the Empire could barely contain the power of all these Daedra, while the other provinces were left to the wolves, so to speak. So, Thalmor gained credit for saving all of the Somerset Isles and are seen as heroes of elven kind amongst the Altmer. And the Thalmor are possibly quite skilled with magic. I mean, that should be obvious, but they have the means, more so than a mere mortal, to deal with the vengeance that Daedra can wreak. They are probably more than capable of holding off the Daedra by themselves, but it was still responsible for stopping the Oblivion crisis with what Martin Septim and the Hero of Kvatch did. But now the Thalmor are rising in power, and they have to regain their power by trying to fight the Empire to bring them to destruction and to try to make a multipolar Tamriel where they can cajole different states of Tamriel that come under their power. Despite the struggles of the Empire and its overextension and the skill with which the elves fought in the Great War, the supply lines and the size of Tamriel in actuality do kind of frustrate any ambitions for total domination of the continent. For example, the Septim Empire could not totally rule Black Marsh. The inner core of Black Marsh is inaccessible to anybody save the Argonians, or maybe magic users that are very advanced, because the Argonians have evolved in that land, and the Hist kind of protects them and serves as the element of metempsychosis for them to reincarnate into the world, independent of the dream sleeve. So that's an example of a place that's very hard to invade. The Empire could never fully rule the interior of it. They had some coastal cities like, I believe, Lilmoth, and Morrowind is also a very hostile land. It's on the other side of Tamriel. The High Elves probably hate everything about the culture of the Dunmer, because the Dunmer would be seen as absolute traitors to what it means to be the Elves and Oriel. And you have a place like Skyrim surrounded on all sides almost by mountains, the frigid and inhospitable Sea of Ghosts. There are ways to fortify that country, and the independence of Hammerfell speaks for itself in the Great War, when they didn't want to acquiesce to the terms of the White Gold Concordat 5 years into the Great War, and they were let loose by the Empire, so the Empire could still abide by the treaty. It's mainly the Empire's dilemma with a place like the Bay of Topal and the Abetian Sea, which is adjacent to the area of the Somerset Isle. But by and large, the different environments, as varied as they are in climate, pose difficulty for the Aldmeri Dominion to gain dominance. Nevertheless, the Thalmor use their political power to enforce their whims abroad, and they try to tear down Talos supporters, because Talos represents the cementation of Lorkhan by having his spot filled by a living god, a mortal god, one that is not an Etada, Talos, who ascends to that position and enforces convention, linear time, the mortal world, and essentially may very well be a god of man. If the Thalmor can get rid of worship of him, it is likely or possible that the influence of Talos would dwindle and his power to affect things in the world. If you played the Knights of the Nine Oblivion DLC, you know that there is a spell that allows you as a divine crusader to travel to the plane of Meridia and take on Umaril and kill him, even though he was previously able to escape as being like a half Daedra, half divine, elven type figure, and you're able to completely extirpate him. Well, this is because of Talos. So, even though it would seem that most of the Aedric type gods, Talos is not an Aedra, let's be clear, have little influence because of their partaking of the creation of Mundus, then he still has influence, and this is what the elves want to stamp out. They don't have the ability or the interest to deal with the Ansha'lil in Black Marsh, and I think that even though they would not like the culture of the Dunmer are not the target number one on their list. It may very well be, and some people speculate in lore, but this is more like a fan fiction. It's not something confirmed, that descendants of the Aliens may have fled as refugees to Somerset Isle. And it can be very easy to see the Altmer, the High Elves of Somerset Isle, wanting to reestablish the city-states and the dominion of aliens, or some type of facsimile in the Fourth Era. So, whichever your character is, you kind of see everywhere throughout the world the effects of this conflict. You see the veterans of the Great War. You see the turmoil that has been stirred up, because with some